Good evening. Tonight begins with a moment that is at once quiet and consequential. On January 26, 2026, a Republican candidate for governor of Minnesota stepped in front of a camera and said he was done, not pausing his campaign, not suspending it, ending it. Chris Madel, a Minneapolis attorney who had been seeking the Republican nomination for governor, announced that he was leaving the race. He did it through a video statement. And in that statement, he explained why. He said he could not support what he described as national Republicans' stated retribution against the citizens of Minnesota. Those words matter. They were chosen carefully. They were delivered calmly. And they landed heavily. Madel did not frame his decision as a tactical calculation or a campaign setback. He did not cite fundraising totals or polling numbers. He did not point to exhaustion or family considerations. He spoke instead about principle, about limits, about a line he said he could not cross. He described actions and positions taken by national Republican leaders. And he said those actions, in his view, would amount to retribution directed at Minnesotans. Sometimes, he said, you realize the road ahead isn't one you can walk. That was the tone. Measured, controlled, not theatrical. The announcement came at a specific moment. Federal immigration enforcement operations were underway in Minnesota. Operations that Madel characterized as overly expansive. Operations, he said, went beyond constitutional bounds. In his statement, he did not dispute the existence of immigration law. He did not call for its abandonment. Instead, he focused on how those laws were being enforced. He said the scope of the operations troubled him. He said the methods raised constitutional concerns, and he linked those concerns directly to his decision to end his campaign. Madel is not a newcomer to legal conflict. He is a practicing attorney in Minneapolis. And before this announcement, he had been involved in a high-profile case. He had represented an ICE agent. That representation drew attention. It placed him in proximity to the very enforcement apparatus he would later criticize. And it gave his words a particular weight. He was not speaking from a distance. He was not offering abstract commentary. He was speaking as someone who had been inside the legal machinery, as someone who had defended a federal agent, as someone who understood how those operations functioned in practice. That context matters, because it frames his critique. In his video, Madel said that the federal immigration enforcement operations in Minnesota were unconstitutional. He said they were overly expansive. Those are legal terms, not slogans. They suggest a specific concern about scope and authority. They suggest an argument grounded in constitutional law, and they reflect a discomfort with how power was being exercised. Madel connected those operations to what he described as the national Republican stance. He did not isolate the issue to one agency or one incident. He spoke about a broader posture, a posture he said amounted to retribution against the citizens of his own state. I can't ask people to trust me, he said, if I can't stand up for them. Again, the tone was restrained, but the implication was unmistakable. This was not a quiet exit. It was a public declaration of disagreement, and it was directed upward, toward his own party's national leadership. The date is important. January 26, 2026. The campaign season was active. The race for governor of Minnesota was underway. Candidates were positioning themselves. Messaging was being refined. And in that environment, Madel chose to withdraw. He chose to say that continuing would require an endorsement of actions he could not support. He said he could not be part of a movement that would punish Minnesotans. That word again, retribution. It implies intent, it implies direction, and it implies harm. Madel did not enumerate specific penalties. He did not outline hypothetical scenarios. He stayed within the bounds of what he said had been stated. He referenced national Republicans' own language, and he said that language was incompatible with his candidacy. His announcement did not include an endorsement of another candidate. It did not include a call to action for voters. It did not include a roadmap for his political future. It was focused narrowly on the decision at hand, ending the campaign, explaining why, and drawing a boundary. The video format added to the gravity. There was no crowd noise, no applause, no stagecraft. Just a candidate speaking directly, addressing the camera, addressing voters, addressing his party. In doing so, Madel placed himself in a specific position, not as a critic from outside, but as someone who had sought office under the Republican banner, someone who had participated in the process, and someone who was now stepping away because of what he saw at the federal level. His critique of immigration enforcement was not abstract. He said the operations were overly expansive. That suggests they went beyond their stated purpose. He said they were unconstitutional. That suggests a violation of foundational legal principles. And he linked those concerns to the idea of retribution, the idea that enforcement was not merely about law, but about punishment, directed at a state, directed at its residents. Minnesota, in this telling, was not just a geographic location. It was a community, a group of people, and Madel said he could not support actions that targeted them in that way. Politics, he said, should never ask you to betray your own conscience. That line lingered. It did not accuse. It did not threaten. It simply explained. And then he was done. The campaign ended not with a concession speech, but with a statement of refusal. A refusal to continue under terms he said he could not accept. A refusal to align with what he described as retribution. And a refusal to separate his legal understanding from his political ambition. This is where we are tonight. A candidate out of the race, a party confronted with internal dissent, and a decision that raises questions about how far alignment can stretch before it breaks. We have more to unpack here, because this announcement did not emerge in a vacuum, and its implications extend beyond one campaign. We'll continue. When Chris Madel spoke on January 26, 2026, he was not introducing himself to the public, he was clarifying himself. And that distinction matters, because his decision to end his campaign did not come from a place of distance or unfamiliarity with the issues he was addressing. It came from proximity, from involvement, from experience. Before this announcement, Madel had already been publicly connected to federal immigration enforcement. He had represented an ICE agent in a high-profile case in Minneapolis. That fact is not incidental. It places him inside the legal framework he later criticized. He was not speculating about how enforcement worked. He had defended someone operating within it. That experience shaped his language. It shaped his concerns. And it shaped the weight of his decision. In his video statement, Madel criticized federal immigration enforcement operations in Minnesota. He said they were overly expansive. He said they were unconstitutional. Those are not casual accusations. They are precise. They reflect a legal assessment, not a rhetorical flourish. And they come from someone trained to understand constitutional limits. Madel did not describe a single raid. He did not point to a lone incident. He spoke about operations, plural, ongoing, broad in scope, and in his view, exceeding what the Constitution allows. That distinction is important, because it signals that his concern was systemic, not episodic. He was not reacting to one headline. He was responding to a pattern, and he linked that pattern directly to the posture of national Republican leadership. He said he could not support what he described as their stated retribution against Minnesotans. Again, the word choice is deliberate. Stated. Retribution. He was referencing language that had already been used. Language that, in his view, framed federal action as punishment. Not enforcement alone, but punishment directed at a state and its residents. Madel's critique did not come with a disclaimer. He did not hedge. He did not say he partially disagreed. He said he could not support it. And that inability, he said, required him to leave the race. This is where his earlier legal work becomes relevant. Representing an ICE agent placed him in a position to see enforcement from the inside, to understand how authority is exercised, to understand how discretion is applied, and to understand where constitutional questions can arise. That experience did not lead him to endorse broader enforcement, It led him to draw a boundary. In his statement, Madel did not question the legitimacy of federal law. He did not argue against the existence of immigration enforcement as such. Instead, he focused on scope and constitutionality, on whether operations had expanded beyond lawful limits, on whether they respected constitutional protections, and on whether they were being used as a tool of retribution. That framing matters, because it situates his decision within a legal and ethical framework, not a partisan one. He was not arguing policy preference, he was arguing constitutional principle. Madel said that continuing his campaign would require him to support actions he believed were wrong. That is a specific claim. It suggests that alignment with national party leadership was, in his view, a prerequisite for candidacy, and that alignment would have meant endorsing enforcement practices he could not defend. "I couldn't look people in the eye," he said, "and pretend this didn't matter." Again, the delivery was restrained, but the implication was clear. He believed that silence would equal complicity, and he chose not to be silent. The timing of the announcement is also significant. January 26, 2026. This was not early exploratory phase. This was an active campaign period. Ending a campaign at that stage carries consequences. It affects supporters, it affects donors, it affects the party's field of candidates. Madel did not minimize that, but he did not dwell on it either. His focus remained on the reason for his decision: the federal immigration enforcement operations, the constitutional concerns, and the concept of retribution. His reference to retribution against Minnesotans reframed the issue. It was no longer about immigration alone. It was about federal-state relations, about whether national leaders were willing to use federal power to punish a state, and about whether a gubernatorial candidate could align with that approach. Madel answered that question for himself. He said no. The video format reinforced the seriousness. There was no campaign branding, no slogans, no applause, just a candidate explaining why he was stepping away. The absence of theatrics made the message more direct. It was not designed to rally. It was designed to explain. And that explanation rested on a simple premise: that there are limits. Limits to what one can support, limits to what one can justify, and limits to what one can ask voters to accept. Madel's criticism of federal immigration enforcement was specific to Minnesota. He did not generalize to other states. He did not speak in hypotheticals. He spoke about what was happening where he lived, where he practiced law, and where he had sought to serve as governor. That local focus grounded his argument. It made it less abstract, and it made the idea of retribution more tangible. Minnesota was not an abstraction in his statement. It was home, and he said he could not support actions that targeted it. There is also the question of internal party dynamics. Madel's announcement implicitly acknowledged tension between state-level and national-level priorities. He did not accuse state Republicans. He did not criticize local party infrastructure. His focus remained on national Republicans, on their stated positions, and on how those positions translated into federal action. That distinction suggests an awareness of where he believed the pressure was coming from and where he believed the problem lay. His decision to end the campaign rather than continue in opposition is also telling. He did not say he would stay in the race to fight these positions from within. He said he could not continue at all. That suggests he believed the conflict was fundamental, not something that could be managed or compartmentalized, but something that went to the core of the campaign itself. "You don't run for office," he said, "to abandon the Constitution." That line was brief. It was fact-neutral, and it carried emotional weight. It encapsulated his reasoning, his legal background, and his justification for leaving. By the end of the video, the conclusion was unmistakable. The campaign was over, not because it failed, but because continuing would require a compromise he would not make. This was not a dramatic exit. It was a principled one, at least as he presented it. And it left behind a set of facts that now have to be reckoned with. A Republican candidate for governor, ending his campaign. citing federal immigration enforcement, calling it unconstitutional, and saying he could not support what he described as retribution against his own state. Those facts stand. They do not require interpretation. They speak for themselves, and they set the stage for what comes next. Because the question now is not just why he left, but what his departure reveals. About the campaign, about the party, and about the moment we are in. We'll take that up next. By the time Chris Madel finished speaking on January 26, 2026, there was no ambiguity left in the room. The campaign was over, not paused, not reconsidered, ended. And what remained was not a vacuum, but a record. A clear set of statements, a clear sequence of events, and a clear explanation that now stands as part of the public record. Madel had entered the race for governor of Minnesota as a Republican candidate. He had done so as a Minneapolis attorney. He had done so with professional experience that included representing an ICE agent in a high-profile Minneapolis case. Those facts did not change when he exited the race. What changed was his willingness to continue under conditions he said he could not accept. In his video announcement, Madel drew a straight line between federal immigration enforcement operations in Minnesota and his decision to leave the campaign. He said those operations were overly expansive. He said they were unconstitutional, and he said they reflected what he described as national Republicans' stated retribution against the citizens of Minnesota. That is the complete explanation he offered. There were no footnotes, no alternate reasons, no secondary justifications. He did not cite internal campaign disagreements. He did not reference electoral math. He did not suggest personal hardship. He spoke about enforcement, constitutionality, and retribution, and he said those issues made it impossible for him to continue. I had to stop, he said, because I couldn't keep going honestly. That line did not add information. It clarified intent. It underscored that this was a decision he framed as ethical rather than strategic. Madel's departure narrowed the field in the Republican race for governor. That is a factual outcome. But his explanation did something else as well. It documented a moment of internal conflict, a moment where a candidate publicly stated that alignment with national party positions had reached a breaking point, not over rhetoric alone, but over federal action taking place in his state. The immigration enforcement operations he criticized were not hypothetical. They were ongoing, they were federal, and they were happening in Minnesota. Madel's objection was not to the existence of enforcement itself. He did not say enforcement should stop entirely. He said the operations as conducted were overly expansive and unconstitutional. Those are legal conclusions. They are assertions rooted in constitutional interpretation, and they came from someone trained in law. That matters because it defines the nature of his critique. It was not framed as ideological disagreement. It was framed as constitutional concern, and he said those concerns were inseparable from the idea of retribution. The term retribution carries weight. It implies intent to punish. It implies a response directed at behavior or identity. Madel said this retribution was aimed at the citizens of Minnesota, not at a government abstractly, not at political leaders alone, but at residents. That framing elevated the stakes. It transformed a policy dispute into a question of collective impact, and it explained why he said he could not continue asking for their support. Madel's earlier role representing an ICE agent adds complexity, but not contradiction. He did not disavow that representation. He did not distance himself from it. He did not claim it was a mistake. Instead, it existed alongside his critique. It suggested that his concerns emerged not despite his experience, but because of it. He had seen enforcement up close. He had participated in the legal process, and he had reached a conclusion he said he could not ignore. His announcement did not propose reforms. It did not outline alternative enforcement models. It did not suggest next steps. It was not a policy speech. It was a closing statement. The campaign was ending, and the reason was incompatibility with actions he believed violated constitutional limits. The absence of speculation in his message is notable. He did not predict what would happen next. He did not warn of future consequences. He did not assign motives beyond what he said had been stated. He stayed within the boundaries of what he could assert. Federal immigration enforcement operations in Minnesota were, in his view, overly expansive and unconstitutional. National Republicans had stated positions he described as retribution, and he could not support that. Those are the facts as he presented them. They stand without embellishment. They require no inference. They do not rely on implication. They are complete on their own. By ending his campaign publicly and explicitly, Madel ensured that his reasoning would be part of the public record, not inferred, not leaked, not reconstructed, stated directly, in his own words, at a specific time, on a specific date, January 26, 2026. That clarity is itself significant, because it leaves little room for misinterpretation. He was not forced out. He did not withdraw quietly. He did not leave without explanation. He said why he was leaving, and he said it plainly. There's a point, he said, where you either stop or you stand for nothing. That line, again, added no new facts, but it captured the emotional core of his decision. It explained why he framed his exit as necessary rather than optional. The political consequences of his decision will be addressed by others. The strategic implications will be debated elsewhere, but the factual record remains fixed. A Republican candidate for governor of Minnesota ended his campaign. He did so in a video announcement. He cited federal immigration enforcement operations in the state. He called those operations overly expansive and unconstitutional. He said he could not support what he described as national Republicans' stated retribution against the citizens of Minnesota. And he concluded that he could not continue his campaign under those conditions. That is the full arc. From candidacy to conclusion. No speculation is required to understand it. No additional context is necessary to restate it. The decision is documented, the reasoning is stated, and the campaign is over. In moments like this, clarity matters. And whatever else this moment represents, it is clear. Clear in its language, clear in its timing, and clear in its conclusion. Chris Madel is no longer a candidate for governor of Minnesota, and the reason he gave is now part of the historical record. That is where this ends.